Couple minutes till we'll get started. Appreciate y'all all coming out tonight. Look forward to sharing. And well, there comes Adam. So he's on time. You're on time. Angela, would you listen to a word of prayer, please, ma'am? Amen. We're going to start off tonight talking about, well, I use the term clues. Clues, of course, can be evidence of the resurrection and some of the information that we have. And before I do that, I want to give you an example. It says in the Cambridge English Dictionary that a clue is a sign or some information that helps you to find the answer to a problem, a question, or a mystery. And Wiktionary says that it's an object or a kind of indication which may be used as evidence. And I'm going to give you a quick illustration in my own experience there of that photograph. That's a wadded up piece of paper. And more than 40 years ago, I was assigned to investigate a case, a very serious case. And it had taken place in a field, in a grassy field, in a vehicle. And I went out there to the scene to look around, and there were no tire impressions because it was grassy. You could just see the imprint, that was all. And all you could do is measure the wheelbase distance, that sort of thing. But as I looked around, I found a small wadded up piece of paper. It's the only thing I saw out there. Of course, I retrieved it, photographed it, and retrieved it. Carried it to the crime scene people. We unfolded it, and written in pencil on it was the word Apple, A-P-E-L, Ridge, and a phone number. Now let me ask y'all, if you had that, what would be the first thing you'd do if you was investigating that? Call the phone number. Very good. Yeah, y'all could have got a job. And even I could figure that out. So I called the phone number, and it was a development, a subdivision development in Forsyth County, and it was Apple Ridge, A-P-P-L-E. And so I had a description of the man and his vehicle, and he was described as kind of a rough-looking fella, like a construction worker, and he's driving a truck. It was beat up pretty good, and it had tools on it and so forth. So I concluded he was connected, obviously, to that work site. So I talked to some people there and gave a description, said, do you have any idea who that might be? And they gave me a name. They said, yeah, we think we know who that is. Well, I didn't have enough to charge him at the time, so I brought him in, and he agreed to come in and talk to me. And, of course, I had to go kind of easy on him. And I said, would you do me a favor? I probably need to get back in touch with you. And I gave him a notepad and a pencil, and I said, could you write down for me where you work? And he wrote it down, and he spelled Apple, A-P-E-L. And that's a clue. And so even I picked up on that. And so then later on, of course, the victim was able, in a photo lineup, to identify him, pick him out. We charged him. He was convicted. I testified to all of that. That was a piece of evidence in the trial, was that piece of paper with that writing on it. So that's an example of a clue that may not seem like much initially, but can turn out to be a key piece of information that leads you somewhere. And that certainly did me. That's the one that came to mind when I thought about this. So I want to look at what I've called clues here about the resurrection, or evidence of the resurrection. The first one, we've already touched on this in detail, so I won't do that. But the first one is the broken Roman seal. Now, that's extremely important. We may not pay much attention to that, but that's extremely important because of what that signified. As I told you last week, to break a Roman seal without authorization was a death penalty. So the fact that that seal that had been placed on the tomb was broken was very significant. Now, there is no evidence anywhere, not in the scriptures, not in extra-biblical historical records, is there any evidence anywhere that they ever looked for Jesus' body. There's no evidence of that. And as I said before many times, I'm convinced because they knew who he was, and they knew they weren't going to find it. They sealed it. It represented the power of Rome. The penalty was execution, so having broken that seal is a key piece of evidence or a key clue as to what happened there. Because if you'd broken a Roman seal and something hadn't happened to those guards there, they would have been, either they would have killed you on sight, taken you into custody, or they would have launched an investigation to see who in the world would have broken that seal. The second one that we talked a good bit about is the stone removed, but I want to talk about something in particular there. We know the story in the Gospels of how the women went to the tomb on Sunday morning before daylight initially. Their plan was to do a better job of preparing the body for burial. Now what they would do was they would put spices, flowers. We still buy flowers for funerals. And as a matter of fact, the shroud, they found evidence of the imprint of certain type of flowers on the shroud, which all, by the way, go back to Jerusalem. And so on that Sunday morning, that was the first thing they noticed, the fact that the stone was removed. And so it may be more now, if the stone was just rolled from the door, that'd be significant. But if there was something more than that, it would have attracted their attention even more. And I think there's more to that. All the Gospels mention the removal of the stone, and that's the first thing they focused on. It was on their minds, how are we going to get this stone out of the way to get in there to further prepare the body for this time in the tomb. And by the way, something I hadn't touched on, and I won't get into detail about, is that this manner of burial was unique to that part of the world, to Jews, and particularly in Jerusalem. And many of these graves, these tombs have been found. The ossuaries, which were the boxes, they would put the bodies in the tomb. They would wait about a year for the body to decompose. They'd go back and retrieve the bones, the skeletal remains. They would clean off the skeletal remains and they'd put them in a box called an ossuary. As a matter of fact, in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem is the ossuary of Caiaphas, the high priest. And his bones were still in it, by the way, when they found it. And they matched it to a man from that area 2,000 years ago that was 60 years old. There's no doubt it was Caiaphas. It says it on his ossuary. So that's how they would do that. But they would put flowers and spices and so forth with the body, partly to keep the stench down as it decomposed. And all the Gospels mention the fact that the stone was removed so they had access to it. That's what they were going to do. Now, this is the key verse here in John 21. Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. She saw that the stone had been removed or taken away in the KJV from the tomb. Now, according to Randall Price here, who's a researcher and a writer on these things, he's also an archaeologist, he says the manner in which it had been rolled away was what was exceptional. The use of the perfect middle passive participle. We have some school teachers in here. Y'all know about past participles. What's the past participle right there in that in John 21? Somebody want to tell me? I'll just give y'all a pop quiz here. The past participle, you teachers, removed. The word removed. And so the use of the perfect middle passive participle, and that's getting really complicated in the language, the original language in Greek, could suggest that the stone had been thrown some distance from the tomb. Therefore, in this case, the stone may have been forcibly moved aside. Now, the way that the Gospels describe the stone having been removed, it mostly sounds to us like that they just pushed it to the side or rolled it to the side. But think about it, if when they got there, the stone not only was gone, but it was lying way over there somewhere, it would have a different impact. Why? What moved it over there? And according to the language in John, it had been removed or taken away. Taken away indicates, that's what's in the KJV, indicates that it was a good distance away from the opening of the tomb. So that may be part of what the Roman guards saw. they may have seen this stone being hurled to the side without seeing anybody being there to touch it, because it would have been done by angelic beings or by some force that they couldn't observe. So it therefore appears that when they got to the tomb, the stone had been cast away a great distance from the tomb, which changes how we view that quite a bit. The next one's the empty tomb. We talked a good bit about that. But here, this man, Paul Altheus, who was a great theologian, he said that the fact that there was no body in the tomb was too notorious to be denied. There's no body there. His supporters, his disciples and others, after they got their courage up, having learned that Jesus had been resurrected, because they were learning that and believing that very quickly, most of them, that they were telling everybody. The Roman guards had hurried into town and told the Jewish leaders that they had been frightened by these things that they couldn't explain. And so he says it's too notorious to be denied, and there's no body. The tomb's empty. The Jewish leadership never denied that. They never refuted the fact that the tomb was empty. All they said was, well, his disciples came and got it. By saying that, and by hiring these Roman guards and paying them a lot of money to tell that story, they're acknowledging the body's not in the tomb. Now, they're implying it's probably somewhere else because they stole it, but they've acknowledged it's not in the tomb. So he goes on to say the resurrection could not have been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned. So from the get-go, from the time the women arrived on Sunday morning, they knew the tomb was empty. But it was more than just the tomb being empty. The grave clothes were there, and nobody could explain that, obviously. Now, here's another man. By the way, he just died recently, Dr. Paul Mayer. The Jewish and the Roman sources admitted that the tomb was empty. And so they were coming up with a cover story to try to explain that away. He said, positive evidence from a hostile source, which is the strongest kind of historical evidence. In essence, this means that if a source admits a fact decidedly not in its favor, then that fact is genuine. So the hostile sources are the Roman guards who were there, and as it turns out later, their commander all the way up to Pilate, and the Jewish authorities. They're admitting it, but they're trying to explain it away, as bad people always do. He goes on to say, if all the evidence is weighed carefully and fairly, it is indeed justifiable, according to the canons of historical research, to conclude that the sepulchre of Joseph of Arimathea, in which Jesus was buried, was empty on the morning of the first Easter. And no shred of evidence has yet been discovered in literary sources, epigraphy, or archaeology that would disprove this statement. By the way, epigraphy is the study, the expertise in the study of ancient languages. And so that's one of the things that's really being advanced now in archaeological research and historical research, is these epigraphers are going back and looking at, because they have technological means now to read things they couldn't read before on steles, stone steles and so forth, and they're going back and being able to determine what it says. And they can determine by the language, the ancient languages, when it was written. It's remarkable. You wonder what kind of person would want to do that, but thankfully there's a lot of people who do it. And they learn all sorts of things for us that we didn't know up until now. So it was an indisputable fact that the tomb was empty on Sunday morning. And of course the next one is the missing body. Not only is the tomb empty, but there's no body, and it's not found, and it's never been found. I'll tell you this. I had a doctor one time, a medical doctor. He was my primary care physician. And I went to Israel in 2014, and I had to have medical authorization to qualify to go for training. And he did that for me. So the next time I saw him, he asked me about that trip. And I was talking to him about it. And I told him about going to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and how convinced I was that that was where Jesus' tomb was. And he looked at me and he said, "Are his bones there?" I never went back to that doctor. I got me another one. If a man has to ask me, an American doctor has to ask me if Jesus' bones in the tomb, I ain't talking to him no more. And I sure ain't going to let him examine me medically. I quit him that day. I won't tell you his name. He's down at Flower Branch. The missing body. And that was incredibly offensive, and obviously he didn't believe. I mean, he was terribly ignorant, or both. So anyway, there is no record of a search, as I said, for Jesus' body. There's no indication of it anywhere. We can find in ancient historical writings, extra-biblical sources that reference the crucifixion of Jesus. And they talk mostly about the crucifixion, the fact that it was done under Pilate. I've presented some of these here on Sunday mornings at the devotion. And sometimes as I get older, I lose my train of thought, and I just did. But there's no record that they ever searched for his body, nowhere, in any of those extra biblical records or anything else. And they didn't search for the body because I'm convinced they knew there was not one they could find. He was resurrected. So this going back to the Gospel of Peter that I mentioned last week, and this is from the Apocrypha. It says, "Then they all drew near and besought him," that is Pilate, "and entreated him to command the centurion and the soldiers to say nothing of the things which they had seen. Pilate therefore commanded the centurion and the soldiers to say nothing." Now I go back after I do these programs and I watch it to critique myself and try to make sure I'm being clear. And last week I don't think I was very clear. I may have confused you when I talked about the fact that they were ordered not to tell this story. The story that they were ordered by Pilate never to tell was the story of what they saw at the tomb. In going back and looking at that, it didn't seem to me that I was real clear on that. That you could have thought I was talking about the cover story. But it was the story or the account of what they saw at the tomb that he ordered them not to ever tell again on pain of death. And so he commanded them, Pilate therefore commanded the centurion and the soldiers to say nothing. Now, if you were a Roman soldier and Pilate, who was the governor of that area, who was a vile man, a killer. By the way, if you've never studied the biography of Pilate, among other things, he was a cavalry commander in the Roman army. He was very high ranking. He was from a very rich family, powerful family. And so everything in his life centered around the fact that he had this position in the Roman military, in the Roman government. And that's why the Jews knew when they said to him, "We want him crucified, and if you don't crucify him, you're no friend to Caesar," that he went along with them. Because the most important thing in his life was that position. So this was a powerful man, and this was a man who would kill you at the drop of a hat. This is a man who would crucify you if you wasn't a Roman citizen at the drop of a hat. They were terrified of this man. He was worse than Vladimir Putin. And so if he ordered him, he gave them a direct order on pain of death. Don't you ever tell his story again. They may not have, unless it was in their old age when it didn't matter anymore. And so according to the Gospel of Peter, they went to him, the Jewish leaders went to him with these soldiers and said, "We want you to give them an order never to tell what they saw again." They knew what they'd seen. And they were also ordered not to ever say anything, not to repeat that story that they had heard, according to this apocryphal book. Now here's another interesting, you move over to Acts chapter 5. This is a likeness somebody came with of Gamaliel. Gamaliel was one of the most brilliant rabbis who ever lived, according to Jewish history. And at the time, he was alive, of course, at the time of Jesus' life. Paul studied at his feet. Paul tells us in his writings that he studied at the feet of Gamaliel. He was given his credentials. And Gamaliel was a brilliant man. A lot of people think that Gamaliel became a Christian because of this and some other things. And so the Sanhedrin came together, the Sanhedrin being the Jewish leadership, and they were deciding what they should do about this group because Christianity is beginning to proliferate, and they're trying to decide what they should do, and they're talking about, going out and killing, imprisoning and killing these people, torturing them about telling this story. And so Gamaliel speaks up, and among other things, he gives some examples of some movements that had failed because they weren't genuine. And he says this, but if it is of God, and he's referring to the story of Jesus' resurrection, he said, but if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God. So they took his advice. Now Gamaliel could not have said that sometime after the resurrection if they had any idea where the body was or what had happened to it. So they knew that there was no body in the tomb, there was no body to be found. And so he's giving them some advice. If I were you, I'd let that lie because we may be opposing God. And a lot of people think, based on that statement and some others, that Gamaliel had become a Christian. Hopefully that was the case. So here's another one, Howard Brandt. He said this, there were many people in the days of Jesus that wished they could find the bodily remains of Jesus. If they could be found then or now, it would prove that he did not rise from the dead or raise from the dead as he said he would. It is interesting that we're told in the New Testament that people tried to cover up his resurrection. They promoted the lie that his disciples came secretly and stole the body. You would think that if they really had the body, they would have buried it in a huge ceremony, and we'd have remnants of the tomb today. So Howard Brandt there is saying, either way, if they had the body, if permitted his followers, if they still believed that he was a great rabbi or something, but the people who would most likely have buried him and had a big ceremony was his enemies, and say, hi, he said he's going to rise again, here he is, we're going to bury him, we're going to have a big funeral. So that's his take on it. By the way, that non-corpus delecti, anybody know what language that is? Ask Latin. Who said Latin? Ask Latin, yeah. Non is simply mean none. There is no corpus delicti. In other words, body of a crime, either the body or the evidence of the crime. I thought I was being cute when I did that. And so the next one is the grave clothes. And these are really critical, really critical. And if we have the opportunity, the time, hopefully we're going to look at the Shroud of Turin. Most remarkable, I was out on front this morning with Cody. Cody's been reading a lot. Cody had some really good questions and really good discussion. And that was one of the discussions, the Shroud of Turin. And we'll hopefully get into that because that is some mesmerizing evidence and information. So what I want to point out here are the number of times that the Gospels mention the linen cloth, the linen shroud. And you see Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they all talk about it. It's mentioned here 9 times. I'll get to that in a minute. It's in the New Testament 9 times, the linen shroud, the linen cloth that Jesus was wrapped in his body and buried. Now that's calling their attention to something there when it's mentioned 9 times. So it tells us in Luke that this is after the women come and tell them that the tomb's empty. The stone's gone, it's been thrown aside, and it's empty. And so Peter and John take off to the tomb. They're all excited. They want to go see for themselves. They didn't believe women much back then. They couldn't testify in court. And so Peter and John ran to the sepulchre and stooped down. This is Peter. Beheld the linen clothes laid by themselves. Then they took the body of Jesus, it says in John, and wrapped it in the linen clothes. But it tells us there that when John and Peter, you know how that was, John was probably much younger than Peter. So he took off, he was so excited, he took off and left Peter as they ran to the tomb. But when John got there, he just stopped and looked in. Now it tells us they stooped down and looked in, so it tells us that the entrance was low. It was pretty low. And Peter, he comes lumbering up. I can see Peter come lumbering up all out of breath because he's an older man, probably heavier. And Peter just goes on in, impetuous Peter that we read so much about. He just barrels on into the tomb to see for himself. And then John follows him in. And it tells us that Peter beheld that. Don't tell us what Peter's thinking or response was, but it tells us what John's was. And it says that John believed, though he did not yet know what the Scriptures said about this. Now what that tells us is that John, because of what he observed in the tomb, convinced him without any doubt that Jesus was resurrected. The body just wasn't removed, he was resurrected. And there's plenty of reason for that. This is where he stooped down, saw the linen clothes, didn't go in, John, and so on. The wrapping that had been on his head was not lying with the linen clothes, but was folded up in a separate place by itself. Now, there's a reason for that, as there is for everything. And this causes a lot of confusion for the minimalists who want to say, well, this can't be accurate about the shroud and the sudarium, it's called. But the sudarium was used to cover his face. So when Joseph of Arimathea was given authorization to retrieve Jesus' body from the cross, and he took his entourage out there, it would have had to have been a bunch of strong young men to take the body down off the cross and handle it. They would have taken this cloth and covered his face. That's a Jewish custom, a Jewish practice. Before they did anything else, they would have covered his face with that cloth, out of respect. I found my maternal grandfather, after he had a heart attack and died, catfishing many years ago in 1968. And I remember the second person there was an uncle of mine who, when he got there, the first thing he did was take his shirt off and cover my grandpa's face. And whenever I read about this, I always think about my uncle wanting to cover his face. And he'd been there about 24 hours on a hot day. And so the sudarium was placed over the head to cover the face. They would have left it there while they removed the body from the cross, when they laid it out on what's called the stone of unction, and when they began to prepare the body for removal from that site and wrap it in the shroud. Only when they wrapped it in the shroud did they remove the sudarium from his face. But it was buried with him because it had his blood on it. And in a Jewish burial, if a person dies a violent death where they bleed, they bury the blood with the body. They don't clean the body. They leave all the blood and all the injuries obvious. They wrap it in a shroud. They will even go so far, in the case of Jesus, and when we get to the shroud, hopefully we'll do that and talk about it. One of the things they discovered in the shroud was dirt at his feet. By the way, that dirt goes back to a particular gate in the old city of Jerusalem. And they had probably scooped up the dirt under the cross where his blood had dripped and buried it with him. They do that now. They have an organization in Israel that when somebody dies a violent death, a Jew dies a violent death, whatever the circumstances, they go out and retrieve the body and all the body parts if they're separated from the body. And they try to soak up all the blood they can. And if there's blood in the soil, they'll scoop it up. So, therefore, that's why that he was wrapped in the shroud. That's why the blood is on the shroud, because he had died a violent death called mingled blood, which hopefully we'll get to. And the sudarium then was removed from his face. But for some reason, they noticed that it was lying to the side. Now, it don't designate, the Bible does not designate that Jesus did that. There's no indication. A while back there was a story that went around that meant that he folded it a certain way and they recognized it because he folded that and it was talking about his return. They probably just laid it to the side when they put his body there. But they noticed that. And they noticed particularly the shroud and how it looked folded up in a place by itself. The sudarium, it's called. So the linen cloth, as I said, it appears 9 times in the Gospels. It's flaxen thread or yarn. It's made from papyrus. It's a very elaborate, lengthy, very time-consuming, labor-intensive process. It's a 3-in-1 herringbone weave, which particularly was used at the time of Jesus. That's one of the things that they've studied. It was very expensive, especially one that was high quality. The one that Jesus' body was wrapped in, we believe the Shroud of Turin, was an extremely expensive shroud. Joseph of Arimathea purchased it. Joseph of Arimathea had become a follower of Jesus. And he remained faithful to him even in death, even though he didn't understand all of that. So, John tells us that the burial cloths were bound in strips. And they can tell that in the Shroud of Turin, they can tell by studying it that there had been strips of cloth tied around his feet, about his ankles. His arms are held together like this, like we still do today, and tied together. His mouth is tied shut. I remember when my granny died in 1965, they closed her mouth and put a cloth around it. Put coins on her eyelids, I still remember. So the logical synthesis there means everything combined, everything taken into account. The body of Jesus was bound at the hands and feet along with a chin bandage and then wrapped in a single linen shroud. And there's an artist's depiction of what that may have looked like when the body was laid in the tomb. I put that in there. I like that painting. This is supposed to be John and Peter running to the tomb. This artist, I don't remember who the artist was, but he's got that look of apprehension and excitement on their face there, don't he? They're headed for the tomb. John hadn't gone off and left Peter just yet, but that's a very popular painting. You can see it on sale everywhere. So what they tell us, the first thing that stuck in the minds of the disciples was not the empty tomb, but the empty grave clothes, undisturbed in form and position. Now, if you're going to steal a body out of a tomb, if you get to it through a bunch of kill crazy Roman soldiers, you're not going to unwrap the body. You're going to grab it and take off with it, grave clothes and all. The grave clothes are still there, and they're not disturbed. They're just empty. Whoops. So, was it in the form of a body, slightly caved in and empty like an empty caterpillar's cocoon with the imprint of Jesus' body? Now, most people believe that's what they saw, that the body had just left the grave clothes. The strips were still tied. Everything was in place. It's possible that some of the spices they used had caused it to harden somewhat, so it remained in its original form without the body in it. And that's what they saw. But I believe they saw a whole lot more than that. I think they saw the imprint of Jesus' body on it, which we have today in the Shroud of Turin. And I believe it was a whole lot clearer then than it is 2,000 years later. And that's why that John saw that and he believed, though he did not understand the Scriptures. He believed that Jesus had resurrected from that body, from that grave clothes. And there's a photograph of the Sudarium of Aviato. It's called the Sudarium of Aviato because it's in Aviato, Spain. And there's where John references the napkin that was about his head, not lined with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. Now, let me see what's up next here because my time is up. They have matched that positively, scientifically, to the face on the shroud. There's absolutely no question. You don't have to, it don't require faith. Scientifically, that Sudarium and the shroud was on the same man's face. And the blood has been typed on both of them. It's both AB blood type. That's the rarest blood type. And who do you think has the most AB blood type in the world? Jews. They have the most in the world. And anytime that they do blood testing of Jews that are 100% Jewish, they almost always have AB blood type, which is interesting. That don't rule it out entirely, but it's the weight goes toward that being the case. So here's John's reaction. We talked about it. He saw and believed. He did not yet know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. He just believed he had based on what he saw. Peter's reaction, he ran to the tomb. When he stooped to look in, he saw only the linen clothes. So he went home amazed at what had happened. Now I'll conclude with this. In the Masoretic rite of Holy Week, they still use this term. Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. And as you see, that was from the 6th century liturgy brought to Spain by Arab Catholics and is still used today. That's how they interpreted that. That he saw the imprints on the grave clothes, the imprints of the man. So Peter entered the tomb. We know how that went there. He saw the burial clothes. He went home amazed. Now here's what Rick Cromie says. It's entirely reasonable that all the relics the disciples would have kept, treasured and memorialized, it would be the burial cloth that wrapped their resurrected Messiah. Surely a cloth that held the Messiah wouldn't be abandoned. We could also expect a disciple like Peter and John to retain the burial shroud as evidence Jesus was no longer in the tomb, especially if that evidence showed markings of resurrection. So what he's saying is, Peter and or John took the grave clothes with them when they left. Now think about this. The women have come and told them, the tomb's empty. He's not there. They hurry to see. Now in the meantime, we don't know how much time has elapsed. The guards have abandoned that post and gone and told the Jewish leadership what they saw. They probably, as I said last week, left all their gear there. They wasn't going to bother to get it up. They just took off when they came to themselves. So, Peter and John knew we got to act quickly. They're going to be here in a minute. They're going to be coming in a minute. And they knew that if the Romans and or the Jewish leaders retrieved those grave clothes, they would destroy them. They would have hidden them away or destroyed them. And so Peter and or John, no doubt, took the grave clothes when they left. And they hurried home. It says both of them went home. Now they would have hidden those because they were still afraid that they were going to be hunted down and crucified because they've crucified their leader. They're being accused of having removed his body from the tomb. If they could have caught some of them, they would have tortured a confession out of them saying, yeah, we took the body. So they go tell the people, yeah, that's what they confessed. The Russians do that. You know, the Russians torture you till you say what they want you to say, and then they convict them in court. All the despotic regimes do that. And so they would have known that they were in grave danger, no pun intended, grave danger, because they had these grave clothes. They were connected to Jesus, and they didn't have time to dilly-dally. They grabbed up those grave clothes and they took off and went home. Hid them somewhere, and no doubt put them out for other disciples and other believers to see. Listen, this is what we found. These are the grave clothes. Look at that. He's resurrected. Now, the Shroud of Turin, sometime in the 80s, they did carbon-14 dating, and they said it only goes back to the Middle Ages. It's a fraud. It's a fake. What that did, God used that to prompt people to start looking at other sources and evidence. One of the things they looked at was the historical record. They've now been able to trace the shroud back to Jerusalem in the 1st century. And the theory among most of those researchers is Peter took them. And he held on to them for a while. He made sure they couldn't be found by the authorities. And then sometime later they wound up in Edessa in possession of King Abgar, who had converted to Christianity and had supposedly written letters to Jesus during Jesus' ministry asking him to come and heal him. And Jesus responded, sent a message back to him and said, I'm doing these other things. It became known as the image of Edessa. and it was there for hundreds of years. So fascinating to think about. Peter and John grabbing up those grave clothes, and they knew what they had. And they had no doubt. And they took them and said, look what we found in the tomb. Not only is the body gone, but this is how we found the grave clothes. And we have them today. Isn't that remarkable? We have them today in an age of advanced technological research that 50 years ago, 75 years ago, none of that could have been determined. And now they continue to learn something almost every day about it. Hopefully we'll look at that some. Anything? I've gone over my time. Anything, anybody question or comment? Correction? I'll go back and critique myself later. But y'all can now if you want to. Well, I wasn't worried about you, Angela. I was worried about Ronnie. It was Ronnie I was concerned about. Thank y'all for coming. Brenda, would you dismiss us, please, ma'am? Amen.